The police stop a black woman for a minor traffic violation. No weapons, resistance, or danger, just a tired woman driving home after a long day. However, for Officer Ken Riley, her skin color is all the reason he needs. There is no greeting, no professionalism, just escalating aggression. He hurls racial slurs, questions her presence in a white neighborhood, and when she calmly asks for his name and badge number, he screams. He slaps her. Right there. In public. And then? He arrests her. Accused of resisting arrest, handcuffed as a felon, but Officer Riley has no idea who he just attacked. The woman in the plain blouse is Vivian Dubois, a senior supervisory special agent for the FBI. That slap didn't just start a case, it lit a fire. What followed was a career-ending reckoning, a federal investigation, and a courtroom shootout that made national news. This story is about power abused, and justice won. And if that makes your blood boil, you must listen to every second. Don't scroll away. Hit the like button to support Vivian. Leave a comment. Justice for Dubois if you support her. Subscribe now for more real, raw, powerful stories like this one. Justice isn't given. Justice is fought for. There was a heaviness to the evening air that wrapped around your chest and held tight. The sun, just beginning to slip beneath the skyline, burned gold on the edges of the clouds, casting long shadows on the asphalt below. Marcus Reed adjusted the air conditioning dial in his car, not for the temperature, but for the noise. White noise helped him think, helped him forget, at least for a moment. His silver Lincoln sedan cruised slowly through a sleepy suburban stretch outside Arlington, Virginia. It wasn't a new car, but it was clean, well-kept, like everything else about him. Reed, 52, was the kind of man whose presence whispered restraint not just in the cut of his dark blazer or the meticulous part in his salt and pepper hair, but in how he held silence. Years in counterintelligence had taught him the cost of words and the currency of stillness. Today had been long. His mind, usually as sharp as a blade, felt dulled at the edges. 3 briefings, 2 secure calls with interagency directors, and a closed-door meeting with a senator who thought diplomacy meant speaking louder than everyone else. Reed was tired. Not just the kind of tired that begged for sleep, but the deeper kind that sat in your bones. The kind only black men of a certain age knew, the kind passed down like an heirloom. He wore a plain navy dress shirt with no tie, casual by his standards, comfortable, unassuming, just another man heading home after work. But inside he carried the weight of secrets, classified operations, and battles fought far from headlines or medals. The road curved gently past a string of modest homes. Reed liked this route. It was quiet, tucked away from the main thoroughfares, a shortcut he'd used for years. He slowed at a 4-way stop. No other cars, no pedestrians, just the familiar creak of his brakes and the low hum of his engine. He rolled through the intersection a second too soon. Technically not a complete stop. A minor lapse, but not one that warranted what was about to follow. It started with the siren, sharp and sudden. Then the strobing red and blue lights lit up the rearview mirror. Reed's eyes flicked up, his expression unreadable. He pulled over without hesitation. No panic, just that same old sigh. The one that escaped when a black man knew history was knocking again. Not the history in books, but the kind that rode in the back seat of every interaction with authority. The kind you couldn't reason with. He rolled down the window halfway and rested his hands on the steering wheel. 10 and 2. Exactly as he had taught his nephew, and been taught himself, decades ago. Stay still. Be respectful. Make no sudden moves. Don't give them an excuse. The officer's boots hit the pavement heavily. Marcus could see him in the mirror. A tall man, mid-40s, buzz-cut, squared shoulders, the kind of cop who walked like he never questioned whether he belonged. The uniform hung stiff and authoritative, his right hand already resting near the butt of his holstered gun. There was no good evening. No. Do you know why I pulled you over? Just a bark. License and registration, now. Marcus turned his head slowly, eyes calm. Of course, officer, he said, voice low and even, reaching for them now. He moved deliberately. No rush. No hesitation. He retrieved his documents from the center console and handed them out the window. The officer snatched them without a glance, his eyes darting over the car's interior, then locking onto Marcus with something colder than suspicion. Marcus Reed, he read aloud, like the name left a bad taste in his mouth. What's a guy like you doing in this neighborhood? The tone wasn't just unfriendly, it was loaded, coated in that smug presumption that Marcus had dealt with his entire life, that he didn't belong. I'm on my way home, Marcus replied. This is a public road. The officer's smirk twisted. And where's home? You live around here? About 10 minutes west. A pause. Then the officer leaned in slightly, peering at Marcus like he was a riddle that needed solving. Are you some kind of businessman? Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I work in federal service. That should have been the end of it, but instead it was the beginning. The officer chuckled under his breath. Oh yeah? Everyone works for the government these days. Let me guess. Department of Parks and Recreation? Marcus didn't respond. He just looked forward, his hands still on the wheel. The man's laughter died off as quickly as it began. You think I'm stupid? The officer snapped suddenly. You think I don't know what's going on here? Driving a nice car, wearing fancy clothes, taking shortcuts through neighborhoods you don't live in? Marcus didn't flinch, didn't speak. That silence, his quiet dignity, provoked the officer more than any insult. In that moment, Reed didn't feel like a man. He felt like a target. And the worst part? He wasn't even surprised, because this wasn't new. It had happened in airports, lobbies, and boardrooms, where someone assumed he was there to fix the printer. It happened every time a badge or a title wasn't seen because his skin was seen first. But today, something was different. The fatigue wasn't just physical. It was moral. Existential. He had fought too long, complex and quietly, to let this man, stranger in a uniform, strip away his humanity with a few slung words and a crooked grin. Still, he said nothing. Just breathed. Steady, controlled, watchful. Because the only thing more dangerous than a man with power is a man with power and a grudge. And Marcus Reed knew precisely which one stood outside his window. The air inside Marcus Reed's car had gone still. Even the engine's hum seemed to retreat, replaced by the tightening silence of a moment on the verge of unraveling. The officer still hadn't returned his ID. He hadn't even looked at it, just held it like a weapon, a piece of paper that gave him license to play God. Step out of the vehicle, the officer commanded. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. May I ask the reason, officer? The reply came sharp and immediate. I said, step out of the vehicle. Not a request. An order. The kind laced with threat, dressed in authority. Marcus's instincts flickered. A dozen protocols raced through his mind, each one drummed into him through years of federal briefings. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Do not escalate. Do not resist. He opened the door and stepped out slowly, his movements measured, intentional. The officer took a step back, hand still hovering by his holster. Turn around, the cop barked. For what reason? Turn around. Marcus did, but not out of fear. He wasn't afraid. He was furious, quietly, deeply. But it simmered under the surface, where no one could see it. Not yet. The officer circled him once, inspecting him like contraband, like a package that had been misrouted. His gaze paused at Marcus's shoes, lingered on the creases of his shirt, then drifted up to the silver at his temples. "You look nervous," the officer said, voice low and condescending. "Got something to hide?" "No," Marcus replied. "I'm not nervous." "Really? You should be." He stepped in closer. Too close. The way someone steps into a boxing ring is not a conversation. "Let me guess," the officer continued. "Some federal desk job. Probably got it through a diversity program. That's how you people move up these days?" There it was. The shift. What had been cold professionalism now cracked open to reveal what always lay beneath in men like this. Contempt. Not just for Marcus, but for what he represented. A black man who didn't cower, who didn't shrink, who had something to lose, but wouldn't beg to keep it. Marcus's fists remained unclenched at his sides, though every muscle in his body screamed to respond. He had been trained to handle threats far more dangerous than this man, but he'd also been trained to recognize when a threat was emotional, not just physical. And this was personal. "You think you can talk back because you've got a clean car and pressed shirt? I know your type," the officer sneered. "Think you're smarter than everybody. You people never learn." Marcus turned slowly to face him, not suddenly, not provocatively, just deliberately. His eyes locked on the officer's with a focus that neither challenged nor submitted. It was the gaze of someone who had spent his life walking the tightrope between dignity and survival. "Officer," he said evenly, "you are escalating a situation that does not warrant it." "You don't get to tell me what I'm doing," the officer snapped. He took another step forward, chest puffed. His voice rose with every sentence, drawing power from his volume. "I saw you roll through that stop sign. That's a violation. And now you're resisting instructions. That makes it worse." "I followed your commands," Marcus replied. "I asked for clarification. That's not resistance." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You think your calm voice makes you innocent? That's what gets me. Your people always trying to play the victim. Well, not today." The venom in the word "your" was unmistakable. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't flinch. But something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about a stop sign, or a car, or a uniform. It was about power. Misused. Undeserved. Performed. And Marcus Reed had seen too much of it in too many parts of the world to let it slide here. On a quiet road in Virginia, where the only weapon the man in uniform had was the assumption that his badge made him untouchable. "I would like to call your supervisor," Marcus said calmly. "Now." The officer paused, his jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked left and right, as if searching for an audience. "You want to play tough?" he spat. "Think you're gonna embarrass me? I am the supervisor." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Then we have a bigger problem." That was when it happened. The shift from disdain to something darker. The officer reached out and shoved Marcus. Just once. But it was enough. The contact wasn't brutal. It wasn't enough to bruise. But it was intentional. A warning shot. An attempt to provoke, to bait, to pull Marcus out of the calm he had built his entire career upon. Marcus stumbled slightly, more out of surprise than force, but he stayed upright, steady. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lift a hand. "You just assaulted a federal employee," he said quietly. The officer froze for a beat, then scoffed. "Federal? Are you going with that story? Let me guess, FBI? CIA? NSA? You don't look the part." Marcus stared at him, silent. And that silence? It was the most dangerous thing in the world, because it wasn't a denial. It wasn't a confession. It was a promise. The officer's face twisted. Rage, embarrassment, fear. He didn't know what Marcus Reed was hiding, but he knew it was more than he could handle. Still, he doubled down. "Put your hands behind your back," he barked. "Am I being detained?" "Put your hands behind your damn back." A neighbor across the street had stepped outside, phone raised, recording. Another car had slowed, and the window rolled down. The scene was shifting now, no longer in shadows. Marcus considered the weight of the moment. Every fiber in his body told him this wasn't the end. It was the ignition point. But he turned nonetheless. Slowly, deliberately. Because sometimes, even when you know a fire is coming, you stand still. So the world will see who struck the match. Some moments in life change everything, moments so raw and violent that they shatter the illusion of safety like glass under a steel boot. For Marcus Reed, that moment came in the form of an open palm. He hadn't seen it coming. 1 second he was standing by his car, posture still, voice even, demanding Officer Darren Kovac's name and badge number with the kind of restraint only experience can teach. Next, a sharp crack echoed through the otherwise quiet suburban street, reverberating off street lamps and tree trunks like war drums. The blow landed square across his cheek. Pain, white and electric, bloomed instantly. The force of the slap twisted Marcus's head violently to the left. His body swayed, catching itself before falling. His jaw ached, not just from the sting of contact, but from the humiliation that rode in behind it like a second punch. Kovac's hand had left more than a red mark. It had stripped away the last layer of Marcus's patience. And still, he did not move, because Marcus knew. Knew that in America, in this uniformed country where skin could be a sentence and silence a survival tactic, one wrong move could get you buried. He straightened slowly, deliberately. His eyes, once neutral, now sharp and heavy with controlled fury, met Kovac's. The officer looked almost pleased with himself. His lips curled slightly, like he'd just scored a point in some twisted power game. It wasn't about a rolling stop anymore. It never had been. This was about domination, control, the thrill of reducing a confident black man to something less. And then, the playbook unfolded. "You saw that?" Kovac shouted, stepping back with exaggerated alarm. "He just tried to strike me. Resisting. Get out of the vehicle, now." Marcus blinked. This man, this officer, was fabricating a story out of thin air, flipping the narrative in real time, turning the victim into the aggressor. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, a visceral reaction not from fear, but from the realization that he'd walked into a trap designed long before he arrived. He opened his mouth to object, but Kovac was already yanking the driver's door open. "Out! Hands where I can see them!" he bellowed. And just like that, Marcus Reed, decorated intelligence officer, graduate of the National Defense University, advisor to 2 presidents, was being ripped from his car like a common criminal. His shoulder hit the frame on the way out, but he didn't flinch. He didn't struggle. He didn't resist. Not because he was weak, but because he understood that his strength lay in restraint. He knew the cameras were rolling somewhere, that someone, somewhere, would see this for what it truly was. But it didn't make the moment hurt any less. Kovac grabbed his arms roughly, twisting them behind Marcus's back and snapping on the cuffs with savage force. The cold metal bit into his skin. Marcus winced, not from pain, but from rage buried so deep it throbbed in his bones. "Think you can question me?" Kovac sneered, leaning in close. "You people think you're untouchable. Well, guess what? Not tonight." You people. The words hit harder than the slap. They weren't just racist. They were intentional, designed to dehumanize, to degrade, to remind Marcus that no matter what medals hung on his wall or how many flags he'd saluted, this man saw only his skin. "You're under arrest for resisting a lawful stop and threatening a police officer," Kovac announced, loud enough for the surrounding houses to hear. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Marcus tuned out the rest. His hands were numb, not from the cuffs, but from disbelief. This was happening. It was happening. He was being publicly humiliated, lied about, assaulted, and stripped of dignity in a matter of minutes, all because one man let power mix with prejudice and decided to take it out on the first black body he saw after a bad day. The cruiser's back seat was cramped and cold. Kovac shoved Marcus inside with a smug grunt, slamming the door behind him with finality. From the rearview mirror, Marcus saw Kovac adjusting his radio, calmly reporting false charges and weaving lies into protocol. "Suspect is in custody," he said. "Attempted assault, non-compliant, possibly under the influence." Marcus clenched his fists behind his back, not because he was afraid, but because he had to do something, anything, to stop himself from screaming. He watched Kovac's reflection in the mirror. The smirk, the composure. There was a total lack of awareness of what was about to happen. Because what Kovac didn't know was that he hadn't just slapped a random black man who rolled through a stop sign. He had put his hands on Marcus Reed, Assistant Deputy Director of Federal Intelligence, clearance level Alpha Blue. A man with connections that extended beyond state lines, beyond politics, into the very core of national security. And though Marcus hadn't spoken it aloud, not yet, when he did, the walls around Officer Kovac would crumble like paper set on fire. But he wasn't ready for that moment. Not yet. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Marcus stared out the window. The streets blurred by, lit in streaks of amber and red. The ache in his cheek reminded him of the slap, and the burn in his wrists reminded him of the injustice. But it was his silence that reminded him of power. Real power. Because Marcus wasn't broken. He was witnessing. And soon, the world would too. The silence inside the precinct felt like a pressure chamber. Marcus Reed sat, still in handcuffs, on a cold steel bench that had seen too many stories just like this one. Only this time, the story was different. He wasn't just another man who'd been pulled over, insulted, and humiliated. He was far more dangerous to those who believed themselves untouchable. A man who knew the system from the inside and had the power to expose it. His dark eyes scanned the fluorescent-lit booking area. The hum of cheap lights overhead buzzed like an insect too tiny to swat, but too loud to ignore. The officer who had assaulted him, Brent Halverson, leaned against the far counter, arms crossed, still trying to pretend his authority was intact. But Marcus could see the cracks in the facade. They always appeared in silence, where truth had more room to speak. Sergeant Donovan, an older cop with heavy jowls and tired eyes, finally approached Marcus with a clipboard. He didn't meet Marcus's gaze. "Name?" he asked, his voice bored, as if reading from a script he'd long stopped believing in. "Marcus Reed," came the even reply. Donovan stopped, pen frozen mid-stroke. There was a flicker of something. Hesitation? Recognition? Whatever it was, he masked it quickly. "Occupation?" Marcus held his gaze steady. "National Counterintelligence Liaison, Department of Homeland Security." The pen clattered onto the clipboard. Behind Donovan, Halverson shifted his stance. The name and the title hung in the air like a slow-moving storm cloud. No one spoke. Even the usual murmur of background radio static seemed to lower its volume, as though the station itself knew something had shifted. "Your DHS?" Donovan asked, the skepticism thinly veiled by a forced laugh. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," Marcus replied. "I state facts. You do what you want with them." The sergeant swallowed hard, then nodded to another officer. "Run his name through federal clearance, now." Marcus didn't move. His wrists throbbed from the cuffs, still clamped tighter than they had any right to be. But he didn't flinch. He sat like a stone monument, etched in patience and pressure. Halverson's bravado was dissolving fast. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't know who he was. He didn't say anything." Marcus finally turned his head and locked eyes with the man who had insulted him, shoved him, and cuffed him like a criminal. "I didn't have to." There was a long, electric pause, and then the whisper of boots down the hall. 2 plainclothes agents entered, badges visible on their belts, but no introductions were needed. The taller of the 2, a sharp-eyed woman in a dark gray suit, walked directly to Sergeant Donovan and pulled him aside. She whispered into his ear, firm and quickly. He nodded once, and his entire posture changed. The cuffs came off Marcus's wrists seconds later. Donovan mumbled, "Apologies, Agent Reed. We weren't informed." "You weren't interested," Marcus corrected, rubbing his wrists. "There's a difference." He stood slowly, his full height rising with quiet gravity. Now every pair of eyes in the station was on him, but he didn't need to raise his voice or throw accusations. Like the eye of a storm, his silence did more than shouting ever could. Across the room, Halverson was pacing. Sweat had broken across his forehead. "Nobody told me," he kept saying. "How was I supposed to know? He wasn't in uniform. He was just some guy." Some guy. The phrase landed with the dull weight of centuries behind it. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words had already judged themselves. The agents who arrived with the DHS ID didn't linger. One stepped forward, handed Marcus a sealed envelope, and nodded. "The director wants a sit rep in 90 minutes, she said. "Conference room at Quantico." Marcus nodded. "Tell her I'll be there." Donovan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "If there's anything we can do—" "There is," Marcus said, eyes still locked on Halverson. "Don't erase the footage. Don't alter the paperwork. Let the system work, if you still believe it can." He walked past them, through the doors, into the night air that carried the first cool bite of an autumn storm. But the real storm was just beginning. Halverson slumped into a chair inside the precinct, all swagger drained from his limbs. "I'm done," he muttered. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean—" But it was never about who Marcus Reed was. It was always about what Halverson assumed him to be. And now that assumption had become a crack in the dam. As Marcus entered the black SUV waiting outside, his vehicle long since impounded, he took a deep breath, but not relief. Not yet. He called up a contact on his phone, one reserved for exceptional circumstances. "Marcus?" came the voice on the other end. "I need all records on Officer Brent Halverson, internal affairs, civilian complaints, and previous use of force reports. Everything." Quietly. The voice didn't ask why. In their world, the reason was already known when someone like Marcus made a call like this. Back inside the station, whispers were beginning. Someone had Googled the name. Someone else was watching security footage from earlier in the night. One officer pulled up a video already circulating on social media, of Halverson's voice raised, the slur muttered, the unprovoked aggression. By morning, it wouldn't just be a traffic stop gone wrong. It would be national news. And Marcus Reed? He wasn't just a story, he was the storm coming. The sun had long set when Marcus Reed sat alone in the gray-hued holding cell, his wrists red and pulsing from the cuffs that had dug into his skin for an hour. But pain was not what occupied his thoughts. It was focus. Sharpened, deliberate, and now fused with an unmistakable resolve. He stared at the small metal bench across him, posture straight despite the day's wait. The slap still echoed faintly in the chambers of his memory, but not as shame, as evidence, proof of what still lurked under the surface of American justice. Outside the precinct walls, something had begun to shift, first slowly, like the turn of a massive ship, then with undeniable momentum. A teenager named Jacob Parker had been biking home from a part-time job when he passed the street where Marcus had been pulled over. He saw the lights, the commotion. He also saw the slap. He hadn't meant to record anything, but instinct took over when he paused at the corner, phone in hand. The grainy footage he captured was only 47 seconds long, but it showed enough. The sound of a calm, firm voice asking for a supervisor. The flash of a hand. A slap. The camera is shaking. A woman's voice was crying out in disbelief from a nearby porch. A pair of silver handcuffs glinted under the street lamp. Then, the video went dark. But by the time Marcus was escorted inside, that 47-second clip had already been uploaded, first to a private group chat, then to Twitter, then TikTok, and then to the flood. By 10:13 p.m., the video had over 2.6 million views. And that's when the reckoning began. At the home of Assistant Attorney General Selena Cho, her daughter rushed into the den holding a phone, tears in her eyes. "Mom," she said, "you need to see this." One look at the footage shows Selena's pale face. She had met Marcus Reed once, not formally, but in a national security roundtable 3 months prior. The man in the video wasn't just another citizen. He was a federal officer, a decorated DHS advisor, a man who had spent 2 decades hunting threats, foreign and domestic. Selena picked up the phone and dialed directly. Not the public liaison, but the Director of Internal Affairs for the Justice Department. "This is beyond protocol," she said. "This is federal." Back inside the precinct, Marcus was finally led into a small interrogation room. His silence unnerved the officers more than if he had shouted. Officer Tomlinson was no longer brash. He was twitchy, eyes darting between Marcus and the closed door. The words "Federal Review" had reached his ears, and now his confidence had cracked. "So, Agent Reed," Tomlinson began, trying to smile. "There may have been a misunderstanding earlier." Marcus looked up slowly, his voice as cold as a steel edge. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. "Is that what you call unlawful detention, physical assault, racist language, and abuse of power? That's your word for it, officer?" Tomlinson's jaw clenched. "We didn't know who you were." "That's exactly the problem." Before he could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. The door opened, revealing a sharply dressed black woman in her early 50s, a face of composed fury. She flashed her badge. "Special Counsel Evelyn Morris, Department of Justice. I'm here on behalf of the Federal Civil Rights Division. Agent Reed, you're coming with me." By midnight, #Justice. For Reed had trended in 15 countries. CNN ran a breaking segment. MSNBC followed. Fox News scrambled to reframe the narrative, but even conservative anchors hesitated as the full facts became undeniable. A high-ranking black federal officer had been physically assaulted, detained, and humiliated by a local police officer, all caught on video. And then came the press release. A single-page statement issued jointly by the FBI and the DHS. The Department of Homeland Security is aware of the unlawful detainment and assault of Senior Homeland Security Advisor Marcus Reed. An internal federal investigation has been launched. We are working with the Department of Justice to ensure accountability. Agent Reed's decades of service to this nation will not be disrespected nor ignored. No badge grants immunity from the law. That statement dropped like a hammer. Meanwhile, in the home of Officer Tomlinson, things were unraveling fast. He had tried to call his superior. No response. He had tried to call his union rep. Voicemail. By 2:00 a.m. His name was plastered across digital billboards. Protesters were already organizing outside the precinct, and his wife refused to turn on the TV out of sheer panic. He had always assumed there were lines he could cross without consequence. But this wasn't just any citizen he'd assaulted. This was Marcus Reed. And Marcus wasn't finished. The following day, Marcus stood in a dark navy suit on the steps outside the Department of Justice. Cameras lined the walkway, and reporters huddled beneath umbrellas as light rain fell over D.C. Marcus adjusted the mic. The world hushed. "I did not set out to become a headline," he began, "but I will not waste the weight of this moment." He spoke calmly, but with the rhythm of justice pulsing beneath every word. This was not an isolated incident. It was a mirror reflecting what countless Americans face every day: suspicion, hostility, violence, for no reason other than their race or appearance. The only difference today was that this mirror cracked in public. The crowd was silent. Rain dripped steadily from the microphones. His voice never wavered. "There are many officers who serve honorably. I've worked alongside them and trusted them. But when corruption hides behind a badge, when prejudice is mistaken for protection, we all suffer. And today, we demand more." He stepped back. No dramatic exit. Just truth, left hanging in the air like thunder before a storm. That afternoon, the mayor of the city held an emergency press conference. An apology was issued. An independent civilian review board was activated. Officer Tomlinson was placed on immediate unpaid leave, and his history of prior complaints was made public. And most significantly, the city council announced it would begin a full audit of the entire department's conduct history. Marcus Reed didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. Not yet. Because this wasn't justice. It was only the beginning of it. The real work, he knew, was ahead. But for the first time in a long time, the world wasn't just watching. It was finally listening, and he would make sure it didn't forget. The video hit the internet like a bullet through glass, shattering illusions, exposing truths. Within hours, it was everywhere. Morning talk shows dissected it frame by frame. News anchors stumbled over their words trying to balance outrage and protocol, and social media erupted with hashtags that carried Marcus Reed's name to every corner of the country. Justice. For Marcus, not. Just another black man. Power misused. The footage wasn't grainy. It wasn't speculative. It was sharp, clean, damning. You could see the slap. You could hear the officer's voice, which was condescending and foul. And above all, you could see Marcus not resisting, not attacking, simply absorbing the violence with a stillness that was louder than any scream. By the time Marcus sat in the federal briefing room, freshly released from wrongful detainment, the tide had already begun to turn. The room was hushed. Not out of disrespect, but because everyone knew the air had changed. The weight of this moment demanded reverence. He sat across from Deputy Director Elaine Marston, a seasoned woman with steel in her spine and justice carved into every line on her face. "I saw it," she said simply, folding her hands over the thick file. "No edits, no denials, no distractions." Marcus nodded once. Elaine exhaled. "This is bigger than one officer and one slap." He looked her dead in the eyes. It always was. Across the city, the media swarm had grown. Protesters held signs not just with Marcus's face, but with symbols of federal badges, slogans, and calls for sweeping law enforcement reform. College students staged walkouts. Clergy delivered sermons. Even former prosecutors took to op-ed pages. Marcus Reed was no longer just a name. He was a spark. At his sister's house that night, the living room flickered with the blue glow of a dozen screens. News coverage on one, security footage on another, and live drone footage of protests from significant cities. "He's trending in 25 states," his niece whispered, scrolling through her phone. 25. His sister Sandra turned the volume down on the television. "They want you to speak," she said. "On the steps of the courthouse. The national press will be there. Your voice matters now more than ever." Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, arms crossed. The skyline beyond shimmered with protest candles and camera flashes. For years, his job had been to assess threats, protect infrastructure, and neutralize foreign risks. But he had never prepared for this kind of war, where truth was a weapon and silence was complicity. "They don't want my voice," he said. "They want my pain." "No," Sandra replied. "They want your clarity." He looked at her. For the first time in days, his eyes softened. The following day, Marcus walked into the press room. There was no suit, no podium theatrics, just a man in a dark jacket, the DHS pin discreetly on his collar, and a presence that made everyone sit a little straighter. The cameras clicked. The whispers quieted. "My name is Marcus Reed," he began. "I am a federal officer with the Department of Homeland Security. I've served this country for over 20 years, and 4 nights ago, I was handcuffed like a criminal for failing to bow to a man's ignorance in uniform." He let the silence linger. "There are good cops. There are bad ones. But the worst are those who wear the badge and believe it makes them invincible. I met one of those. And I will not let him define my name, my purpose, or the oath I swore to protect this nation, all of this nation." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Justice isn't a favor. It's a guarantee, written in the Constitution, protected by our laws, and demanded by those who've bled to uphold them. The crowd was motionless, reporters frozen. Every eye was fixed on him. This isn't about me. It's about what happens when unchecked power meets assumed superiority. It's about every man or woman who's been silenced, dismissed, or brutalized and told their truth didn't matter. Today, it does. Then he stepped down, and the room exploded. Not in claps, those came later, but in a shift. An awareness. A mass understanding that something had pivoted. Marcus Reed had gone from victim to voice, from silent strength to a public leader, and nothing could unring that bell. That same afternoon, a panel was convened at the Department of Justice. High-ranking officials, legal advisors, and civil rights attorneys. The Reed case, as they were calling it, was being officially opened for federal review. Not just Officer Halston's actions, the system that allowed them. Patterns of racial profiling, failure to follow the escalation protocol, civil rights violations. It was a domino effect. And the first one had been knocked down by a man who had refused to flinch. Elsewhere, Officer Halston sat in the shadowy corner of an internal affairs holding room. His eyes darted across the table, sweat trickling down his temple. Across from him, 2 federal investigators laid out photos, documents, and timestamps. "This is your voice," one said, tapping the recorder. "This is your hand. This is your victim." Halston's lawyer opened his mouth. "We're still reviewing—" The agent cut him off. "He's not a suspect. He's a federal officer, and your client just made a case study in institutional failure." Halston's face went pale. "You didn't just arrest a man, officer. You woke up a country, That night, Marcus stood outside on his sister's porch. The stars above seemed more straightforward somehow. Or maybe he was just seeing them without the fog of restraint. He picked up his phone, a message from the director of DHS. "We need your voice on the task force. Reform begins now." Another text from a former academy classmate. "Your speech played in every precinct across the state today." And a message from someone he hadn't heard from in years. "I named my son after you, Marcus. I never told you that, thank you." The shift had begun. Not just in policies, not just in headlines, but in the souls of people. Their eyes finally opened. Marcus Reed didn't ask for this war, but now that he was in it, he wasn't backing down. Not when the country had started to listen. Not when power had finally started to shift. The news cycle had only begun to spin, and Marcus Reed's face was already plastered across the nation. Local networks carried shaky cell phone footage of his arrest, slowed frame by frame. At the same time, national anchors debated the deeper meaning of a black man in uniform being treated like a criminal. But the attention came at a cost. 3 days after the press conference, Marcus stood at his kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee he wouldn't drink. His phone buzzed every few minutes. Calls from journalists, messages from former colleagues, requests for comment, warnings from allies. And then came the coded threats. "Hope you enjoy your 15 minutes, Marcus," read one anonymous text, followed by a winking emoji and an image of a bullseye. At first, he brushed them off. He had dealt with worse overseas. But this wasn't Baghdad or Kandahar. This was home, and the bullets here weren't always fired from barrels. They came dressed in lawsuits, policy memos, and social engineering. Later that morning, his mailbox held a letter from Internal Affairs. It was stamped "Confidential" in bold red letters. He knew what it would say before he opened it. "An investigation has been launched into your conduct, including potential breaches of federal decorum protocols and administrative compliance." He scanned it twice. Nowhere did it mention Officer Donnelly's brutality. Nowhere did it acknowledge the footage or the public apology issued by the mayor 2 nights prior. No, this was pure retaliation, dressed in official language. They were going to flip the narrative. Across town, Captain Dana Hart, a longtime friend and fellow agent, sat behind her desk, staring at a wall of monitors. One screen played Marcus's press conference on loop. Another showed internal memos from the Department of Homeland Security. A third displayed news alerts. DHS Officer Marcus Reed sparks national debate. A fourth screen blinked with an encrypted chat. "Dana, pull his security clearance for now. Administrative evaluation. HQ orders. Not optional. ED." Dana leaned back, her fingers tightening around her pen. She knew what this was. The beginning of a purge disguised as a policy adjustment. She didn't reply. Not yet. At that exact moment, Marcus stood before his hall mirror, his uniform hanging limp in his closet. He had not worn it since the arrest. The bruise on his jaw had faded to a dull yellow. Still, something deeper had begun to bruise beneath his surface. A growing awareness that no amount of service or seniority could shield him from the system's reflex to protect itself. He received another message, this time from someone he hadn't heard from in months. "They're circling you, Marcus. Watch your back. Even the people who smiled at you yesterday are folding under pressure today." T. Tasha Jenkins, one of the few insiders who still had a spine. He replied with just 3 words. "I know. Watching." That night, a low-ranking analyst leaked internal emails to a journalist at The Hill. The emails revealed that certain DHS officials had convened a private meeting with state law enforcement liaisons to discuss strategies to neutralize the fallout from Marcus Reed's arrest. Neutralize. That word hit harder than the cuffs had. Marcus read the article twice, his jaw locked and the vein at his temple twitching. They were going to erase him, not with a bullet, but with bureaucracy. One reassignment, one classified demotion, one buried case file at a time. The following day, he arrived at his office to find his badge access revoked. The security guard, new kid, fresh out of college, shrugged when Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Just following protocol, sir." "Whose protocol?" Marcus asked, voice low. The guard didn't answer. Dana met him at the side entrance, tension in her posture. You've been reassigned to desk duty. For your safety, she added with a bitterness that wasn't directed at him, but at the machine she was now reluctantly part of. Marcus stared at her. My safety? Look, I pushed back. But they're scared, not of you, of what you represent. A man in your position shining a light this bright. You think they're gonna let that slide? He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence between them was complete with shared frustration and the knowledge that truth was never enough. As he sat in the temporary cubicle they gave him, a corner without a nameplate, a chair that wobbled, he pulled out a legal pad and began writing. Not notes, not a statement, not a strategy. He would not go quietly if they were to turn this into a war of narratives. That evening, Marcus met with Elijah Sterling, a civil rights attorney known for dismantling corrupt precincts from the inside out. They're playing chess, Elijah said after hearing Marcus's story. But they think you're still playing checkers. Marcus nodded. Then let's flip the board. Plans were formed, statements were drafted, and deposits were scheduled. All the while, the media followed every step, leak, and tactic DHS tried to bury. But it wasn't just the press watching now. It was the people. Veterans began writing in. Black officers from across the country sent private support. Whistleblowers emerged from departments once silent. Marcus's story had become a spark, and it was catching fire. But fire brings smoke. And in that smoke, enemies move. That weekend, a story leaked suggesting that Marcus had once mishandled a sensitive case in 2018. The implication was clear. He had a checkered past. Anonymous sources were quoted. The report offered no proof. Marcus's old commanding officer called him that night. They're pulling your file apart, son. Looking for dirt. Making it if they can't find it. The next day, a letter from the Office of Inspector General arrived. An audit was being launched, and his phone records, travel logs, and bank statements were requested. Marcus laughed, hollow and short. They're scared, he said aloud. Good. The air in Washington had changed. What had started as a single viral video now echoed through the halls of power, picked up by networks, dissected on panels, and whispered about in the closed-door rooms where decisions were made. The system had tried to smother Marcus Reed, but it had failed. On a gray morning, Marcus stood on the steps of the Capitol building, not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a witness. The House Oversight Committee had requested his presence, not just to recount the incident, but also to speak on a growing list of complaints about institutional misconduct in federal and local law enforcement. He wore no uniform that day, just a dark suit, pressed clean. His DHS badge had been temporarily suspended pending review, but his dignity and authority were impossible to suspend. The cameras clicked like insects as he walked past reporters. Mr. Reed, is this retaliation? Will you testify against your agency? Do you regret speaking out? He didn't answer. His silence spoke louder than any prepared quote. Inside the chamber, the room was tense. A handful of representatives looked down at him with skeptical eyes. Others leaned forward with interest. But all of them, in that moment, had to listen. Marcus adjusted the mic. My name is Marcus Elijah Reed. I am a decorated federal officer. I served in counterterrorism units for over 2 decades. I've trained agents, protected national security interests, and upheld the law. And yet, despite all of that, on a quiet road in Kingsford, I was treated as disposable. The room was still. I wasn't pulled over because I broke the law. I was pulled over because I looked like someone who wasn't supposed to belong. because I drove a nice car, while black because I didn't flinch when confronted with authority. I had every right to challenge. His voice didn't rise. He wasn't grandstanding. That's what made it cut so deep. He continued, walking them through the stop, the officer's rage, the handcuffs, the bruises, and finally the name, his name, spoken aloud, which turned the tide. "And that's the part I want you to hear most clearly," he said. "It wasn't my calmness that protected me. It wasn't my training. It was my title. A title that should never be required for dignity." Gasps were stifled. One congresswoman dabbed at her eyes. He ended his testimony with a phrase that would later go viral. "Being a black man in this country shouldn't feel like wearing a uniform you can't take off, one the world treats as suspicious until proven exceptional." When he stepped outside, the crowd had doubled. There were protest signs now. Flags, chants that rose not in anger, but in solidarity. "Justice for Reed. Reform the system. No more silencing." Marcus didn't raise a fist or wave. He just stood for a moment, listening. The dam had broken. That afternoon, DHS released an official memo. The officer who arrested Marcus, Sergeant Ryan Donnelly, was placed on unpaid leave pending an internal investigation. It wasn't enough. The public knew it. So did Marcus. Meanwhile, internal documents obtained by an anonymous whistleblower were leaked to ProPublica. Records that proved DHS had received 3 previous complaints against Donnelly for racial profiling. All had been dismissed quietly, without discipline. The leak sparked national outrage. For Marcus, it was vindication, but not victory. Marcus met with Elijah Sterling and Captain Dana Hart in a quiet meeting room across the city. Dana had already resigned earlier that morning, citing a systemic unwillingness to hold certain people accountable. Elijah brought a thick manila folder with declarations from over a dozen DHS and local law enforcement officers ready to speak out. "Whistleblowers," he said. "They're lining up. But they're scared." Marcus leaned forward. "They won't be the only ones. There are more." "Then we need to protect them," Dana said. "This is bigger than one arrest. Bigger than me. This is the moment we push." And so they did. A week later, a high-profile op-ed by Marcus appeared in the Washington Post. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was strategic. "Institutional loyalty has a way of turning into silence," he wrote. "But silence is no longer an option when power becomes weaponized against its people. I will not stand down. I will not be quiet. And I am not alone." The editorial ignited another wave of attention. Political figures called for hearings, watchdog groups launched inquiries, and the DHS Inspector General's office was forced to issue a full report on departmental bias and internal retaliation. But the pressure had a cost. That same night, Marcus's email was hacked. His private address leaked. His family received threats. Online trolls posted altered photos of him. "Traitor," they called him. "Ungrateful." He was offered a security detail. He declined it. "I'm not hiding," he told Dana. "They've already seen my face. Let them see my spine." Back at his home, Marcus sat on the porch. His mother, a quiet woman who had lived through segregation and the civil rights era, poured him a glass of sweet tea. She didn't say much, just sat beside him, looking at the sky. "You okay?" she asked finally. He looked down. "I should be. But I thought it would feel better." She nodded. "Truth doesn't always come wrapped in peace. Sometimes it shows up in bruises, courtrooms, and long nights where you ask if it's worth it." "Is it?" She looked him straight in the eye. "Boy, you're asking the wrong question. It ain't if it's worth it. It's who it's worth it for." The following day, a congressional subcommittee introduced the READ Act, a sweeping reform bill proposing mandatory bias training for federal officers, independent civilian oversight panels, and legal protections for whistleblowers in law enforcement agencies. Marcus read the draft with quiet awe. His name would be in legislation. But his mind wasn't on legacy. It was on that road in Kingsford, on the sound of gravel under his boots, on the click of handcuffs, on the face of a man who believed a badge made him untouchable. The morning of the Senate floor vote dawned cold and gray, the kind of sky that held its breath. Washington, D.C. buzzed beneath the surface, not with scandal or gossip, but with something quieter and heavier. Expectation. The Reed Act, a bill forged from bruises, testimony, and 1,000 silent injustices, was scheduled for a final vote. Few could recall another time a single name had become shorthand for systemic accountability, and fewer still could remember when that name belonged to a man who had once sat cuffed in the back of a patrol car. Not for breaking a law, but for existing. Marcus stood in his apartment, where everything had unraveled weeks earlier. A place that once held only routine now holds memory, layers of meaning in each room. The bruises had faded from his wrists, but something deeper had taken root beneath the skin. Not bitterness, not vengeance, clarity. He tied his tie slowly, each knot a ritual, not of vanity, but of readiness. He was no longer dressing for a job. He was dressing for something far more permanent. Legacy. The door buzzed. He opened it to find Elijah Sterling holding 2 coffees and a sheepish grin. "I figured you'd forget breakfast." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I didn't forget. I just reprioritized." "Sure you did." They didn't speak about the vote. They didn't have to. The silence between them was the kind only longtime friends could carry. Weighty, but warm. Elijah set down the coffees, then reached into his coat pocket. "I brought something else." He held up a single printed photo, grainy, slightly overexposed. A screenshot. It was the still frame from the video. The moment Marcus turned his head in the patrol car, bruised but unbroken, looking straight into the lens. The photo had gone viral, become a symbol, and made its way onto murals, protest posters, and profile pictures. But in this version, someone had added one line beneath it. "We see you now." Marcus stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it into his jacket pocket. The Senate chamber was crowded. Press badges flashed, aides whispered, and cameras rolled quietly from the gallery. But when Marcus Reed walked in, the room stilled, not out of fear or protocol, but respect. Senator Brielle Moore, the bill's sponsor, nodded at him from across the room. The Reed Act wasn't perfect. No bill ever was. But it was something no one could ignore. It demanded independent oversight for federal law enforcement agencies, protected whistleblowers from retaliation, and established real consequences for racially biased misconduct. It didn't erase what had happened to Marcus, but it ensured fewer people would have to survive what he did. The vote was called. Marcus didn't watch the tally board. He listened instead to the roll call, to each voice stating aye or no, to the sound of democracy clumsily doing its job. When the final count was read, 72 in favor, 25 opposed, 3 abstained. The chamber erupted in applause. Reporters scrambled, cameras clicked. But Marcus didn't smile. He stood still, solid. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Outside, the press swarmed. "Mr. Reed, how do you feel? What do you say to those who still think you overreacted? Do you believe real change is possible?" He paused, looked past the sea of microphones, and spoke with the same calm that had once unnerved a man with a badge and a grudge. "I didn't ask to be the face of anything," he said. "I didn't want this story to have my name, but since it does, I intend to use it. Not to punish, not to divide, but to ensure the next time someone's pulled over for existing, they walk away with their dignity intact." That evening, Marcus returned to Kingsford. He hadn't planned to, but something inside him knew that closure wasn't a place. It was a confrontation. He parked near the spot where it all began. The same road, the same curb. But everything looked different now. Not because the asphalt had changed, but because he had. There were no flashing lights this time. No shouted orders. Just silence. He stepped out of the car and stood still for a long moment. Then, he pulled the photo from his pocket and left it tucked under a small stone at the base of the nearest lamppost, a quiet marker. Not for him. For all the names that never made it past the cuffs. Weeks passed. Officer Ken Riley had been formally charged under federal law for civil rights violations. He faced both criminal and civil lawsuits. His name was now a cautionary tale, his career buried under the weight of his prejudice. But Marcus didn't celebrate. Justice, when delayed, never feels whole. One morning, a letter arrived at Marcus's home. No return address. Inside was a folded note. "I watched it all unfold. I used to think the system protected people like me, but you taught me that the system should protect everyone. I'm resigning, but I'm also learning. Thank you." No signature, just 3 words written at the bottom. "You were right." Marcus folded the letter. Quiet victory had its flavor. He was asked to speak at a local high school shortly after. He hesitated. These weren't senators. These were kids. Skeptical, restless, disillusioned. But he went. He told them the truth. About how justice is often slow. About how speaking out is lonely. About how power is more than a title. It's the choice to use your voice when silence feels safer. One student raised his hand. A girl. 17, maybe. Sharp eyes. "Mr. Reed," she asked, "what would you say to someone scared to stand up?" Marcus thought for a moment. "I'd say fear is real, but so is strength, and sometimes the only way to prove the system is broken is to survive it." She nodded. He saw something in her eyes. Fire. In the months that followed, the Reed Act rippled outward. Other agencies began to revise their protocols. Training manuals were rewritten. Disciplinary systems were overhauled. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't perfect. But it was happening. And in every press release, in every article, his name was there. But Marcus never forgot what his mother told him. Legacy isn't something you get to choose. It's something that chooses you. He still kept the suit, the one he wore the day of the vote, still creased, still clean, hanging untouched in the closet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of who he had to become, to make the country finally listen. Vivienne Dubois didn't wear a badge on her sleeve that day. She didn't pull rank, shout, or fight back. She followed every rule. She kept calm. She tried to diffuse the situation with reason and professionalism. And still, she was slapped across the face, handcuffed like a criminal, publicly humiliated by a man who thought his uniform gave him permission to abuse. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a bad day or a misunderstanding. This was a hate-fueled assault, driven by racism, ego, and unchecked power. A police officer degraded, assaulted, and tried to destroy the dignity of a black woman because she dared to ask for respect. But he chose the wrong woman. Vivienne Dubois was a supervisory special agent with the FBI. And the moment she made that call, the ground shifted. The system that so often protects abusers had no choice but to face the truth. Officer Ken Riley's downfall wasn't a twist of fate. It was the inevitable consequence of years of unpunished misconduct, years of complaints swept under the rug, years of a culture that lets officers weaponize their badge against the people they swore to protect. Let that sink in. If it hadn't been Vivian, if it had been a teacher, a nurse, a student, a teenager, how would this story have ended? Would anyone have believed her? Would the slap even have made it to a report? This case didn't just expose one lousy cop. It exposed a system that failed to stop him long before Vivian's face bore his handprint. But here's the truth. Vivian's story is not rare. It's not new. It's not isolated. It's just one that couldn't be buried. Because she had power and proof. The real outrage is how many victims never get to speak. How many suffer silently. How many are dismissed because they don't carry an FBI badge or know the right number to call? And that's the lesson. We cannot wait until power is on our side. We must build systems that protect the powerless, that hold every officer accountable, not just the ones who get caught on camera. To anyone watching, speak up, document everything, know your rights, and never let fear silence your truth. Vivian didn't just fight for herself. She became a symbol of resistance. She reminded the world that no one, badge or uniform, is above the law. If you're as furious as we are, show it. Hit that like button to support Vivian Dubois and what she stood for. Drop a comment, say "Justice for Dubois," or share your experience. Subscribe to this channel, because next time it could be your city, your street, your story. We share these stories because the world needs to see what happens when silence is broken. And sometimes, the only way to change the system is to expose it, one truth at a time.